Hey everyone, and welcome to my full in-depth guide to Kassadin. In case you're new to the channel, I'm a multi-rank 1 challenger mid laner, and I also played pro play for 4.5 years. Kassadin is a pretty interesting champ. I think he's pretty simple mechanically, but he's got a lot of complexities to him that a lot of people don't think about. And I think it's one of those champs as well, where if you pick him in the right situation, it can almost be a free win. But if you're playing it all the time, then it's going to require a lot more skills. So in this video, we're going to talk about all these things, and by the end of it, you should be a very good Kassadin player. So Kassadin's identity is mainly as a counterpick champion. He's obviously very, very good against other AP champions. He's very, very good against champions that can't punish him in the laning phase. He can also be kind of good against team comps that are very heavy on one damage type. One thing that Kassadin has going for him is it's very easy to itemize something later in your build, like a Force of Nature, an Abyssal, even a Frozen Heart, things that really hard counter if they're stacking, say, all AD or all AP. So that's something you can look for as well. Obviously, there are some drawbacks to Kassadin, which are that it's very difficult to kind of have pressure in the early game, right? Like sometimes you can pressure your lane on the 1v1, but you're almost always going to be giving up pressure over mid lane for at least the first 6 levels, and that can make playing Kassadin solo queue a bit difficult, right? Like if they're able to snowball the game before you're able to scale up, it can become a problem. But if you pick Kassadin in the right times, if you make sure to pick him in games where you know you're going to get the opportunity to scale, then it quite quickly becomes a very difficult champ to deal with. He is very hard to team fight against, especially when he gets ahead. He's also very, very good at side laning, which I think if you know how to abuse, allows you to kind of get ahead, make sure that you're really high on XP and gold compared to the rest of the map, which is also quite important for Kassadin because the Kassadin from behind doesn't bring any utility to the game, but a Kassadin from ahead just completely can 1v9 the game. Kassadin's items can be a bit overwhelming at first because there's a lot of different choices, but we'll go through them all. They're not actually as complex as you think. So first off is the starting items. In my opinion, you should almost always be starting either Darksteel with refillable or Door and Shield and a health pot. And the way I kind of see it is Darksteel refillable is definitely the greedier option. If you can get away with this, you probably should. I like doing this if I'm against a melee champion, especially ones that can't really punish early. You can sometimes get away with this versus ranged champions that aren't very strong early, but normally it's not really worth it. Like if this causes you to lose a significant amount of CS, then it's not really worth it. So I'd say default to Door and Shield health bar against ranged and Darksteel refillable against melee. You can also start tier as well with 2 potions, but I'm not really a huge fan of it. It feels pretty awkward because now that Catalyst costs so much, it's quite difficult to say start tier and pick up a Catalyst on your first base because getting 1300 as Kassadin is very hard. So you're going to be stuck without sustain other than your 2 health pots. And I think that if that's the case, you still need some sustain from, again, either the Door and Shield or the refillable, because Kassadin as a melee is naturally going to take a fair amount of damage. So yeah, I guess you could start tier if you find it to be more useful for you, but I really think starting Darksteel refillable or Door and Shield and a health pot is better. For early buys in Kassadin, you do have a lot of different options, and it mainly depends on your matchup as well as which item you started with. The really obvious one though is if you didn't start with a tier, you almost always want to pick this up on your first base. It's just too strong not to, and getting the stacking early is pretty good. Even though you won't be upgrading the tier super early, it's pretty important just to have more max mana for skirmishes early because it does more damage and you're going to get more ults off. So I'd highly recommend picking up a tier early. Refillable is more of an optional one. So if you start a Door and Shield and a health pot, you might actually not need the refillable sustain, especially if you're in an easier matchup. I guess the way I see refillable is that if I am taking a lot of damage and it's going to allow me to get more CS, I'll look to pick it up. But if I can skip it, I almost always will, because getting towards like your first item on Kassadin is really, really valuable. Darksteel is another one, so if you didn't start Darksteel, normally you want to pick this up sort of early. However, Kassadin is one of the champs where Darksteel isn't as valuable as other AP champs, so normally Darksteel is just like 100% best AP item in the game, and it still kind of is. But the thing on Kassadin is like, one, it's potentially delaying your Roa spike by a little bit, not the end of the world, but it's maybe like a minute depending on if you're getting a lot of kills and stuff. And also it's not that often that you're going to get a lot of kills and a lot of stacks from early skirmishes as Kassadin. So personally, I normally look to pick up a Darksteel if it's like convenient to do so, but I'm not like, I guess, ruining my build to pick up a Darksteel. Whereas on some other AP champs, you would just pick up a Darksteel no matter what. Next, these 4 items, again, mainly depend on matchups. So if you're in heavy skill shot matchups, a lot of the time going something like tier 1 boots is actually more effective than buying, a bit more sustain or a bit more tankiness, just because it's going to allow you to dodge more skill shots. So definitely keep that in mind. If you're against a APCC champ, so examples being like Syndra, Zoe, LeBlanc, Merc Treads are very valuable, especially if they have a jungler that does the same thing, thinking of champs like Sejuani or Elise. Merc treads can be very, very valuable against these champs. There is some sort of risk of doing this on Kassadin because, again, it will delay your items pretty significantly. So a lot of the time, like if I'm just buying this for tankiness, I would rather buy something like a Catalyst, but you can pick this up if it makes sense against their mid jungle, because a lot of the time as Kassadin, as long as you don't fall behind early, even if you scale a tiny bit later, you're going to outscale anyway, so it doesn't matter too much. As for what you actually buy, if you're just looking for direct combat stats, Catalyst makes you tankier. It's better at if you're taking lots of trades where you're expecting to take a lot of damage back. Like I think Catalyst is overall the stronger laning item. If you're just looking to snowball though, like you have a really easy matchup, your opponent can't trade back. If you're going something like Darksteel and Blasting Wand, it's actually quite hard to fight against Kassadin early. Like it does quite a bit of damage. So matchup dependent, you can look to go more aggressively, but ultimately you just need to kind of choose based on the matchup whether you need move speed, do you need tankiness, do we want more damage, do we want more scaling, whatever you want is kind of whatever you're going to pick up for your early buy. Boot options do have a few on Kassadin. So I've got Sorks, Lucidity, Mercs, and Steel Cap. So the thing with boot options on Kassadin is Sork Shoes is the highest damage option, and there's pretty much no doubt about that, right? I would say if you're just building for damage, definitely go Sork Shoes. Times you might want to go something like Lucidity is if you know you're going to be side laning a lot, or if you know that you really need your flash for whatever reason, you can look to take Lucidity. Personally, I don't think it's as valuable because your ult cooldown is already so low. But if you do, again, need there's some cooldown, it can be worth buying. It's also very cheap. So if you just want the movement speed and you kind of want something to spend your gold on because you've based on awkward gold, it can be an option, but honestly, I don't go for it that much. Defensive boots on Kassadin are really, really valuable. So as we said before, Merc treads are very good for tenacity. Now, worth noting on this is a lot of the time you can get tenacity from your runes. So when we talk about runes, we'll talk about legend tenacity as well as unflinching. So sometimes you might have enough tenacity that you can actually skip Mercs and go for something like Sorks. Alternatively, if you didn't pick up the tenacity in your runes, you might find that you need Mercs and can't go something like this. So keep that in mind as well. Steel camps are, I would say they're decent on Kassadin. The thing is, they don't actually provide that much armor. Like it's mainly from the attack. So if you know you're getting auto attacked a lot in fights, this can be good, but it's not as good as you'd think just because a lot of the time on Kassadin's team fights, you'll be going in and out. So it's very rare that you're just taking like auto attack after auto attack, and you're probably better off getting more armor from something like Frozen Heart or even a Zhonya's later on than it is to go steel caps. But again, if they're like full AD or something, it can be an option. Kassadin's standard build pretty much always starts the same with these items here, and then after that you can look for some more situational items. So to start with, you're going to want to complete your Rod of Ages. After that, you have the choice of completing your tier or completing your tier 2 boots. Personally, I like completing the tier 2 boots earlier because I find at this stage of the game, kind of on this one item spike, you can start to look to snowball and get yourself more gold and get ahead, and that can allow you to kind of accelerate yourself and the rest of your items. Sometimes I find if I do go for the Archangel second that it's not as easy to team fight until I actually complete the spike, which is obviously a lot of gold. It also can be quite awkward to build this because you need 1250 if you actually want to buy damage, and sometimes you're just stuck buying the Kindle Gem. Also, you might find that you haven't fully stacked the tier by the time you buy it. So I think overall tier 2 boots in here is better, but you can delay it if you want. And of course, that's your tier 2 boots of choice, depending on what you need. After you complete these core items here, you can start going situational. So we'll talk about all the situational items you can buy down here. But I almost always pick up something before going Rabadon's Void on Kassadin. Obviously, Rabadon's is the highest damage, but normally at this point, something like a Zhonya's or a Frozen Heart or Abyssal, or even Banshees, something like that goes a pretty long way. But yeah, if you do want that full damage, you can just skip this and go Rabadon's. And obviously, these items are situational. Like I think a Rabadon's and Void should almost always be in your build. Like Rabadon's is by far the highest damage. Void is pretty necessary these days because there's a lot of magic resist, but obviously if they don't have any, you don't need to buy it. Alternative mythics, there are really only two, which is Everfrost and Ludens. There was Crown, which was getting played a lot before, but in my mind, Rod of Ages is just a better version of Crowns. I wouldn't worry too much about it. The reason you might go one of these is they do spike earlier. So if you go something like an Everfrost, it does make that one item spike stronger. It's also very cheap as well, compared to something like the Ludens. So it does offer a very nice one item spike. And sometimes there will be games on Kassadin where it is really fast and you want that earlier spike. It also has like a more aggressive build path. If you let's say you base on 1100 gold, you can't buy the Catalyst. I guess you could buy something like a Blasting One refillable, but it can be kind of nice just to buy the chapter and really heavily accelerate. So this is kind of like, you're ahead, the game's going to be fast. You can look for something like this. Ludens it's a bit. I'm not like a huge fan of Ludens, honestly, because it doesn't give any HP. So you're going to be a very, very squishy Kassadin. I know some people swear by it, but I'm really not a fan. It really does make you do a lot of damage, though. Like, it gives the magic pen, it gives the mythic passive, giving more magic pen as well. So yeah, it's probably the highest damage option, but it makes you so one-dimensional and so squishy that I don't really like it. So situational items, we have a lot of different ones. First one is the Medjai's. Medjai's is really good on Kassadin because it's actually quite hard to die if you play the team fights well. Personally, I normally sit on a Dark Seal until after I've completed my defensive items. So I might just buy a Dark Seal somewhere in here. Let's say it gets stacked up. After I have, my Zonya or my Abyssal or my Frozen Heart, that's when I might look to go Medjai's because I know it's kind of hard for me to die. Like, I'm not going to get bursted down anymore. So I kind of look at it more as like a later game item on Kassadin as opposed, or I guess like a mid-game item. You can buy early game, obviously, if you're snowballing really hard, but it doesn't happen that often on Kassadin. Oblivion Orb, I don't think this is very good on Kassadin. It slows down your build path way too much. You don't have great ways to apply it. So yeah, I would recommend staying away from Oblivion Orb, but if they have tons of healing, I guess you could buy it, but it's not that effective in my mind. So next is kind of the variety of defensive items. So when you're getting towards this third item, you can go for something that's kind of like an AP defensive item, something like a Zonya's or a Banshee, or you can actually go a tank item. So I kind of prefer the tank items on Kassadin, honestly. Like, I think if you third item grab something like a Frozen Heart or a Abyssal, especially if they're very heavy on a like one damage type, it can be really, really good to pick one of these up. I guess, like, if you do want one of these, though, it's because you really value the active. Like, the Zonya's active, obviously, is incredible. You can get a lot out of just stasising the enemy team for 2.5 seconds. The Banshee's active is less good, but it's cheap. The thing is, though, like, if you are buying this for the magic resist, I mean, there are much better MR items, right? Like, Abyssal is extremely broken right now, so that's an item you can kind of look towards. Yeah, I would say I'm not a huge fan of Banshees, but you can look for something like that. Obviously, kind of your more situational damage items. So Void, if they have MR, is kind of a no-brainer. It's really, really powerful. If you pick it up here, like, let's say you pick up a Void here, this doesn't feel that good. Sometimes you will have to because they just have so much MR, but this feels quite bad because you don't really have like a huge AP spike and you're also not getting much tank here. So I try and avoid that if possible, but sometimes you might have to. And Lichbane is a weird item. So Lichbane does a huge amount of damage, especially if you already have Rabadon. So the AP on this is doing even more. The thing is that it can be like a little difficult to fit in. Like, if we're replacing a Void with Lichbane, I think if they have no MR, it makes sense. But like, how often does no one have any MR at 6 items? I suppose you could buy Lichbane here before your Rabadons, but again, this makes you very squishy. If you just replace the Zonyas with a Lichbane, then go Rabadon's Void. I mean, admittedly, you will deal a huge amount of damage, but I think it just makes team fighting difficult. It would make you very good at split pushing, so it's an item you can look towards, but in my mind, it's sort of hard to fit the build. It is very good on Kassadin, though. If you can buy it as a 6 item, especially, it's really, really nice. Kassadin has a lot of different viable rune pages and keystones, and so I will go through them all, but the 3 that I think are the best are Conquer, Electrocute, and Spellbook, and so I'll go through those ones first, and then if you want to try some of the more niche ones, you can. So Conquer is the best scaling one, without a doubt. It's really good for extended fights, it's really good in the late game, and the tree that comes with it also scales very well. Presence of Mind means you can get a lot of extra ults off. Legend Tenacity is extremely valuable if they have a lot of CC. And here, I would normally go Last Stand. You can go Cut Down, though, if they have a bunch of tanks, but most of the time you should just go Last Stand. You will pretty much always take Resolve Secondary with this, and you can change these around a little bit. So Conditioning Overgrowth is the best scaling. If you find that you want more tenacity, you can swap this to Unflinching. If you want a stronger early game, you can take Second Wind against Poke or Bone Plating against All In. But normally, if you are taking this, I think it's because you really want to greed for the ultimate scaling. And then down here, pretty much no matter what page you're taking, you can mix and match. So again, Ability Haste is good for the most scaling. Personally, I kind of like taking Adaptive Force with this one, though, just so I have like a little bit more damage early, because you're not actually going to have a whole lot of AP early on Kassadin, just kind of like mana. Which again does damage for you, but I think having a little bit of AP is nice. Depending on matchup, you can look to take, you can go double MR if you really need it. You can also take armor, which can be good against some AP champs anyway, because they have auto attacks, and obviously you're going to get auto attacked a lot. So don't be afraid to, I guess, like mix and match with these. If you want to go double armor, you can. If you want to go double MR, you can, or you can go some combination of the two. Next, we have the Electrocute page, which is much stronger for laning phase and much stronger for early skirmishes. I quite like this page. I think it's a little underrated. So the really nice thing about this is Electrocute obviously is much stronger in trading than Conqueror, especially in the early game, and especially for short trades. You can also get quite a lot of extra sustain just through Taste of Blood. It's very easy for you to proc this with your Q, and it actually adds up to a lot of HP over the lane. You can also get access to some early AP, kind of similar to how Darkseer works with Eyeball. Down here, you do have some choices. I like Treasure Hunter for getting towards the spikes quicker, but you could go Ultimate if you wanted. And then in your secondary runes, I would still recommend taking Resolve, but I would probably take Second Wind or Bone Plating because, again, you're going to want to be trading. So if you kind of choose when the trade starts, you could take Bone Plating and try and trade around it, but Second Wind is definitely more consistent. And then here again, kind of choose what you want. If I were going this build, I would probably go double adaptive, but again, it's up to you. Like, I think you've got a lot of extra sustain with Taste of Blood Second Wind, so you probably don't need more defensive, and I think this will give you a really strong trading setup. The other page I think is super strong is the Spellbook page. So this one is a lot harder to use. I do have a video on how to use Spellbook, and if you don't know how to use Spellbook, I wouldn't recommend taking it. But the real nice thing about Spellbook is that it allows you to be quite strong early, and it also allows you to be strong in early skirmishes. So you see this taken a lot in competitive, because if you are playing Kassadin in competitive, it's very hard to just give up the early game and not do anything. So finding a way to be impactful at, say, like a level 16 fight is a lot easier if you have something like a Ghost or Ignite or a Heal, something at level 6 that you can kind of swap to, that adds a lot of combat power. But I think for solo queue, it's not as good. The only time I would take this would be probably if I'm against like a difficult assassin matchup and I want to swap to something like Barrier or Exhaust at level 6. I know that, you know, I can't survive with the other stuff, but honestly, it doesn't happen that often. So things I would go kind of mix and match. I think Magical Boots allows you to get your items quicker, but chances are if you're taking this, you might be building a Zhonya's later on, so perfect timing can be good. Futures Marker obviously is nice in order to get an item a bit quicker, so I do like taking this some of the time, and Cosmic is kind of a no-brainer as the best one down here. For secondaries, you would probably take Resolve Secondary, but what you take in this really depends on your matchup, so again, we can mix and match here a little bit. If you know you're not going to need these for lane, you could go something like this, but I don't think it's that good, honestly. I really think that you're kind of not playing towards what Spellbook wants. Like, Spellbook is really good at the level 6 spike, right? And I think if you're going something like this, doesn't really make sense. Like, I think you're better off, you know, maybe you go for a level 6 trade around Bone Plating, or maybe you just kind of use Spellbook early game to allow you to scale up in the tank ones. I feel like Presence of Mind, I mean, I can see it, I just don't think it's really the best. The rest of the rune pages, I'll just kind of rapid fire through because I don't think you need them that much. Fleet is probably the most common of the ones that I haven't listed, and it can be useful for skill shot heavy matchups. Having the movement speed from this allows you to dodge skill shots really easily, so I think if you're in a matchup like Syndra, or maybe Orianna or something like that, having this movement speed is really, really valuable. But I probably wouldn't play Kassadin into these champs anyway. I'd be picking something else. If you are being a Kassadin one trick though, you might find the Fleet page to be useful against those sorts of champs. Other things you can consider, there's a Comet page, which I've seen people play. You'd probably play it with something like this. And this gives you actually quite a lot of power in the laning phase, but the problem is it's quite hard to guarantee that you hit the Comet unless you're against a melee champion that you can slow with your E. The thing is though, most melee champions also have a dash, so it can be kind of difficult, and also it does not scale very well. So personally, I'm not a fan of the Comet page, but I know some people do like it. Another thing you can do is like a first strike page. So the reason you might want to do this is if you really, really want to rush out a certain item. I think this can be quite good against tanks that you know you can't kill, but you also have a kind of difficult time taking a long fight against. So a champion like Cassante could be a good option. You know, if you take Conqueror versus Cassante, it kind of doesn't make a difference because no matter what, you can't take a long trade against them anyway. So having first strike just to kind of farm some extra gold off him, look to accelerate yourself before the items could be the better way to play the matchup. Your sums on Kassadin are pretty much always going to be Flash and TP. Flash is really good because you don't have any mobility pre-6, and that's kind of that's the window you're going to get punished in the most anyway. So if you have Flash to help get through that, that's really nice. You can also use it aggressively for something like an R Flash in a team fight, so it has a lot of playmaking potential as well. Teleport just makes the most sense. I mean, you kind of struggle in laning fades, so having teleport to get through that is really nice. You're also a very good champ at side laning, so having TP to make sure you can side lane, you know, get that solo golden XP in the mid game is really, really nice. The only sums you might really consider is if you're running a very aggressive like Electrocute play page, you could go something like Flash Ignite, which, you know, I think it's It's possible in some matchups, maybe if you're versus Silas with Electrocute, I think you could do it, but there's not that many matchups I would look to take this. If you're taking Spellbook though, you might find yourself swapping to, say, Exhaust, Barrier, Ignite, Ghost, Heal, something that allows you to kind of fight at level 6, and all those options are pretty solid, but I assume if you've watched my Spellbook video, you kind of understand that already. So Kassadin's abilities are very, very straightforward, and it should be pretty easy to get the hang of them. First off is the passive, which is that Kassadin takes 10% reduced magic damage and is ghosted. So the 10% reduced magic damage is very, very nice, and that is why traditionally he is a counter pick into those AP champions. The ghosted part is also kind of nice. So ghosted, for those of you who don't know, means you can basically walk through units without collision, as you can see here. This is kind of nice for if you're fighting in a creep wave and you need to either disengage the trade or you want to extend the trade. You don't have to worry about minion block or anything. You can actually just pass through them. So I wouldn't say this is like game breaking by any means, but it's kind of a nice thing, and sometimes you can play around it. Next is Kassadin's Q, which is a point and click ability that deals magic damage, interrupts channels, and also gives a shield. So just by design, this is a very effective trading tool. Any ability that kind of deals damage and grants a shield is naturally going to be quite hard to trade against. Worth noting, it is a magic shield, not just a pure damage shield like something like Victor Q. So that means that if they're dealing attack damage, it's not going to do anything for you. And this shield combined with your passive does make it extremely hard for AP champions to trade against you. It is worth noting that this has a fairly long cooldown. Obviously it goes down with rank, but fairly long cooldown. So you might get abused a fair amount while this is, on cooldown. It's definitely worth playing around the shield as well. Like sometimes even if you can't actually trade with your opponent, you can just Q a creep and kind of use the shield to allow yourself to tank a bit of damage, waste their mana or get a creep for free. So definitely don't forget about the shield part. It's very, very important. Not to mention, it does interrupt channels as well. So there's not that many abilities that are channeled in mid lane, but TP is probably the big one. So if you notice your opponent TPing, you can cancel it with the Q. If you're curious, there is a list of channeled abilities on the wiki, which you might want to take a look at. As you can see, not that many of them are actually useful for mid lane, but an example would be something like Katarina's ult, which is, extremely effective if you make sure to save your Q for it. Another one is Mal's ult. So if you try and play with your Q, try and Q preemptively for when you think he's going to ult, you can actually cancel it and get yourself out of the ult like that. Kassadin's W has a passive, which is the Kassadin's auto attacks deal additional magic damage. So you can see here, just when you're auto attacking, it adds a little bit on top. The active basically empowers it, causing the next attack to deal increased damage and restore missing mana, which is increased against champions. So there's a variety of different ways to use this. It can be useful just for CSing in lane and kind of keeping your mana up. Obviously, it does a fair amount of damage, so it can be very useful to weave into trades if you can, and giving the mana back will allow you to keep spamming. Like if you go for something like a QEW trade, you're going to get all that mana back, and then you're going to be able to continue doing that. Probably the most important thing about this ability is that it's on auto reset, so this is particularly useful for getting more damage out of early trades. You can do something like auto W like this. And it's also quite useful for CSing under tower, either by just using the empowered auto to deal more damage to a creep, or just, like autoing one creep and then Wing it to last hit or something like that. Kassadin's E is a cone skill shot, which deals damage and slows enemies for 1 second. So you can see here about the range. Worth noting on this is that the cooldown is reduced every time an ability is used near Kassadin. So this can be enemy abilities, ally abilities, even your own abilities. As you can see here, all reduce this by a fair amount. This is effective in some matchups. So an example like Yasuo, where he's spamming E on the wave, you will have E up very, very frequently. It's also just very good for team fights and skirmishes because your E is going to be on a much lower cooldown. Riftwalk is Kassadin's ultimate, which is definitely what he's known for. Basically, you cast this and you can teleport in a short direction. You don't actually have to go to max range, so you can teleport to max range like this. You can also teleport right next to you if you so want. The most important thing to know about this ability is that it stacks up. So you'll see you've got this little stack thing here. Every time you use Riftwalk, it increases the mana cost as well as the damage. So it actually doubles the mana cost, which means I think at max stacks, it costs like 640, but it also deals a lot of damage, and it only stacks up to 4. So you can kind of see here, if I give myself infinite mana and cooldown, I'll be able to stack this up very quickly here. And as I get to 4 stacks, so it won't stack any higher than this, but this is when you're going to be dealing the maximum amount of damage, but it's also going to be costing you the maximum amount of mana. So this is going to be pretty important to play around in team fights, because obviously you want to both give yourself a lot of mobility and kind of manage your mana pool, but you need to make sure you don't use it too much too early. So this is something I'll talk about more in the teamfight section, but it's important that you keep it stacked but not too high before the teamfight starts, so that when you are kind of ready to go, you have both like your damage at least partially charged up, but also you haven't spent all your mana already. As for what order you want to max your abilities in, it's pretty game dependent. So normally against AP champs, you have a couple options. You can either completely max Q first, or you can put 3 points Q into Emax. So basically, maxing Q is really, really good for the 1v1. We kind of said it before that every time you put point on this, it's giving you damage, shield amount, cooldown, everything that's going to make 1v1 trading a lot easier. But it isn't really that great for skirmishing. So if you just want to completely bully your opponent out in the 1v1, you just want to keep putting points in Q basically, especially if it's an AP champion. So that's kind of your standard, either 3 points Q into Emax or 5 points Q into Emax. Now, sometimes if you're against like an AD champion, for example, especially ones that spam a lot of their abilities on the wave, you're going to want to max E. So obviously putting points in Q against pretty much any AD champion is pretty useless because the magic shield isn't going to be that valuable for you. And also most AD champs tend to have a lot of sustain. So just poking them down with Q on cooldown is not going to be particularly effective. So you're going to want to max E first against AD champions. And then after that, you kind of have a choice. You can either max W second or Q second. So the reasons for maxing each of these, as we kind of said before, like Q is pretty good for the 1v1, but obviously like by the time you've maxed E, putting points in Q isn't really going to do anything, right? Because it's probably not really going to be like an isolated laning phase anymore. So it really comes down to if the enemy has like a lot of range on their team, or outside of maybe your AD laner, if they have a lot of magic damage, it's probably worth maxing Q second, because like if they have a lot of range, you can look to poke them at the edge of team fights, and the magic shield is going to be quite valuable. If they have a lot of melee though, or they don't have a lot of magic damage, maxing W second after E is probably going to be better. It's just more damage overall. It's also kind of nice for split pushing. So basically, I guess to kind of make it simple for you, if you're against an AP champion, you want to max Q with either 3 or 5 points, then max E, then max W, and put an ult, points in ult whenever you can. If you're versus an AD champion, you're going to want to max E first, and then decide based on how much range they have, how many melees they have, whether you want to max W first and then Q, or you want to max Q first and then W. If you're not sure and you've maxed E first, I would probably max W second, but there are some games, even when you max E first, that you might want to max Q second. Like the abilities themselves, Kassadin's combos are really, really simple, but there are a few that are kind of useful. So the first ones will just be kind of like basic trading combos. So obviously you can look to poke your opponent with Q. It's really important, as I said before, to use that little bit of time where you have the shield to like try and auto creeps or something, or bait out some damage. That can go a pretty long way. If possible, whenever you are trading with someone, you want to start with E if you can. So obviously if they're out of range, like there's no point, right? But if you can start with E first, one, it slows them, so it's easier to chase them down. It makes them harder for them to respond with the trade because you can get out of range sooner, all that sort of stuff. Plus, if you use this earlier, your own Q and their abilities will be reducing the cooldown. So if you do get the opportunity to do an EQ, normally it's going to be better, but like a lot of the time in lane, you won't really have the option. If you're against like another kind of like melee champion, the abilities like order you use these in might depend a little bit. So for example, if you do like an EWQ, that's like probably the best way in terms of cooldown, but sometimes you'll just want to Q first because some of their damage might come out while you're still closing the gap. So an example would be if you're versus something like Silas, I like to Q first because if you get hit by the W, which is going to be the ability he's maxing, before your shield goes off, then you're not going to avoid as much damage as you should. So I wouldn't worry too much because it's like the E cooldown, especially in the early game, it's like very unlikely you get to use it on cooldown anyway. So both QEW or EWQ are both going to be fine. If you do get the opportunity and it's going to be a really long trade, try weave in some autos with the auto reset. So like let's say you go like this, maybe we go for an auto W and maybe another auto on the way out or something like that. Alternatively, like maybe we've already used Q to get a CS and we're just looking for a quick E auto W trade, like that can be very effective as well. In general, W is just very, very good for trading against melee champions, so definitely keep that in mind. If you're looking for kind of like all-ins or something like that, you're normally going to want to lead with R, and depending on kind of how low they are, depends on how you use this. So like if they're pretty high HP and you're just looking for kind of short trades, you might just want to like REQ them or something like that. Like that can be decent damage. If you're looking more for an all-in, you might need to get on them first. Like, I don't know, either start with R into E, do something like this. Alternatively, if you can get in range, you can E them first for the slow to guarantee your R hits. So as you can see, like there's not really that many actual combos. It's more just like the abilities. You've got to think about like how, it'll just like sort of make sense for you, I think, how you want to use them most of the time. Some more advanced stuff though, so probably the only flash combo you really need to know is the R flash, and this can be useful for extending both the damage and the range of Rip Walk. So if, for example, I've got like this this target here, if you see, if I just use a regular R, I won't be able to reach this target. But if I use an R flash, I can actually hit them, and you can see it deals damage as well. So this takes a little bit of getting used to, actually, like the range. This is definitely something that when I was new to Kassadin, I would misjudge quite a lot, and I wouldn't actually cover the distance. So like the example with this dummy up here, even if you are flash perfectly, you can't actually cover the distance. So try and get used to it, because at least to me, when I was new to Kassadin, I thought this looked like a coverable distance. So yeah, just try and practice a little bit. It's pretty simple though. All you really need to do is press R and then flash afterwards. The timing is like fairly forgiving, so yeah, it really shouldn't take too long to get it down. Obviously, I haven't mentioned it so far, but of course you can use R to get over walls, and it's actually like pretty long range, you know, like even when you're not exactly right next to the wall, right? I've still got quite a bit of extra room here. You can still get over the walls most of the time. It kind of works the same with some of these bigger walls. Like even, I'm pretty sure if you like cast it in the middle, yeah, you see how I put my mouse like on this waterfall? So like even if you're like a fair amount from it, you can still actually get over to the other side. When managing your stacks, what I normally do is in the early game, when I don't have much mana, normally I just play on one stack like this. This allows me that if I do want to start stacking up for some sort of all-in, I can stack it higher if I need to, but otherwise I'll just kind of sit on the one stack. When I'm kind of in that early mid game, you know, maybe I've got my Rod of Ages completed, I'll normally, like before the team fight starts, be kind of sitting on 2 stacks. If I see the fight is like really starting to heat up, I might go to 3, but for the most part, again, we're sitting on this. I think once you complete both your mana items, you pretty much want to be sitting on 3 or sometimes even 4. Again, just like you need to kind of read how the fight's going and see what stacks you need to be on, but what being on 3 allows you to do is you can kind of, you know, you can use 1 to kind of close the gap, and then, you know, once the cooldown comes back, you can already be at max damage the moment you go in. Dependent as well a little bit on your runes, you know, like if you've got Presence of Mind and you know you're going to get a lot of mana back, it might change a little. So I think it's something that sort of comes with experience. My recommendation though would just be don't stack it too high too early, because something I see a lot of Kassadins do is stacking it way too high and then actually just like running out of mana and then you can't dash out anymore. The way Kassadin wants to play most team fights, and again I'll go through this in the team fight section, is you want to kind of like get in, do your damage, you know, get out, wait for your cooldowns, go back in, sort of thing. You're not looking to, I guess, like, you don't want to die. Like, you can die in Kassadin, but because you're a champion that has such high sustained DPS, you shouldn't really feel the need to. You know, it's not like a champ, you blow all your cooldowns and then you're done. It's like, if you stay alive longer, most of the time, you will actually keep putting out relevant damage. So that's very important as well. I'll quickly add here, it is kind of important to play around your Conqueror stacks too, if you are using that. So you'll see examples of these in the team fight section, but something you might want to do is, you know, maybe you're like kind of prowling around the edge of the team fight. You're just kind of like managing your Conqueror stacks, you know, like if you can look for Qs and just like look for little E's on people, you know, just kind of get it stacked up. A lot of the time, you know, there's a very big difference if you're starting a fight with, say, 0 Conqueror stacks. You know, if you manage to get a quick trade on like a tank or something, and that means like before the fight starts that you're, you know, starting on maybe 8 stacks, then by the time like you're ready to go in, you know, you might be like fully stacked Conqueror, which would, you know, make a very big difference. So definitely keep that in mind if you are taking Conqueror. Kassadin's laning phase is where a lot of the champion's difficulty comes from, and knowing how to kind of manage the laning phase, not just kind of for you, but also for your team, is really, really important. So this is a matchup here, which I think is pretty easy for Kassadin, but as with most Kassadin matchups, you are going to have to give up priority early. Even in the matchups you win, it's pretty hard to get prior just because you don't really have enough wave clear. But a lot of the time, you know, if you're hitting 6 and you're even with your opponent, you're in a very, very good spot. So in the early game, you're pretty much just, you know, as level 1, you're going to want to start E or Q, kind of depending on, you know, which one do you need to farm. In this game, I was able to start E. Maybe you could have started Q. You do want to be very careful of your opponent's level 2 spike. So here, I knew he'd already used 1 cooldown, so that's kind of why I walked back up, but I still took a little bit of damage, and that's quite important. So the 2 things that are going to happen to you very often on Kassadin is either, if you're against a good player, you might take too much damage in the first 3 levels, and then you get dived here at level 3, or if they get so much control of the lane and they know you're playing Kassadin, they will try and invade your jungler on the side that they didn't start. So an example would be, you know, if Elise clears her camp's bot side, the enemy jungler and Galio will look to invade Elise on their red buff. So in order to avoid these, there's like a couple different things you're going to do. You obviously don't want to lose a lot of HP. That's very important, right? Like if you lose a lot of HP, you're going to be very diveable. It's also better, and now this isn't really up to you, but it's better to let them crash 2 waves rather than crash 3. Because if they crash 3, it's on a really good timing for them to invade your jungle, whereas if they crash 2, they kind of have an awkward thing where they sort of need to clear out this wave, but it's not super easy for them to do it when it's up this far. Another way you can kind of protect your jungler is after or on this third wave, when you get kind of a convenient time, is actually to ward up here. So warding the side that your jungler is now clearing on as Kassadin at around 2 minutes 30, I think is very, very valuable, because at least that way, if the enemy mid laner goes or the jungler invades, they're not surprised, right? The reality is you don't really want to be involved in these super early skirmishes as Kassadin, but preventing your jungler from getting invaded on their second buff and preventing you from getting dived at level 3, those are the most important things. If you can get past those two kind of like checkpoints and nothing bad happens by that point, you're in a very, very good spot. As for the 1v1, there isn't really that much you can do. Most of the time, if you're against some melees, like you can trade, like Silas is again a good one, where you can kind of trade defensively with EQW. Your Q usage in the early game is pretty important too, so there's not that many champions where it's worth actually using Q on them in like before you get 2 points in it, I would say. Because the thing is, like every time you use Q on like your opponent, it means you can't use it on a creep. And what you really don't want is to bleed a lot of CS and then kind of not actually be able to get the items you need to trade with them anyway. A lot of the time, your Q poke early game sort of doesn't do anything. If I like spam Qs on Galio and it like causes them to burn a potion, that doesn't really make a difference, right? But if I can get more CS with it, then that actually might make a difference if I can get a better item on my first base. So my recommendation is don't use Q on your opponent too much. Try and maximize your CS before first base, and then after first base, that's when you want to start to look to trade a bit more aggressively. Against ranged champions, the game plan is going to be pretty similar, where you're just trying to again like minimize the amount of damage you take in the first few levels, try and maximize the amount of CS you get. There is one thing that is a bit more difficult about ranged champions, which is that they generally have much more control over the wave. Normally, the second win Endurance Shield, you can sustain the damage, but it's the wave that becomes difficult. So the problem is that you have against a lot of ranged champions is that after they crash these waves, eventually the wave will bounce back to them. And especially if you are playing against a ranged champion that has gank setup, it can be very difficult to crash this wave when it starts to push back out. So I think here, can't quite remember. Yeah, so eventually at this point, right, it's starting to push to her. And this is very, very scary because it's like you're an extremely gankable champion. You don't really have the wave clear to break the freeze. And especially if your jungler just showed somewhere else on the map, you're like very, very vulnerable. So if this happens, ideally you want to call your jungler to come help you. If they can't help you, then you pretty much like want to try crashes without dying. Like you really want to make sure you play towards a ward or like play towards their safety. In other words, like you just need to make sure you survive kind of this period of the game. If your opponent's bad, they will probably just like push it back to you, which is very nice, but honestly, like they shouldn't. It's really bad for them to do that. And yeah, you kind of just want to crash this wave when you can. Now, this normally, I think you would put more points in Q versus Karma. I think this is back when Emax was really broken, but something you can do is if you are trying to break a frozen wave, is you actually can just put a second point in E just for that. So kind of be fluid with your abilities, right? Here, it worked out because Echo showed bot, so it meant that I knew he wouldn't be mid, and I was pretty safe to crash on this. But again, if you are forced to kind of like take a bad reset here, it's not the end of the world. The most important thing, again, as I said, as Kassadin, is that you get past those checkpoints of not being dived, your jungler not falling behind, and that as long as you can keep up in CS, after you go for your first base, it's going to become very, very easy to trade. As you can see here, as you get later in the lane, you get stuff like your Tier and your Catalyst. Eventually, your opponents will just become scared of you because they know that if you take a trade, you are just going to win it. This matchup specifically, you can cancel the Anivia ult as well, which makes it even easier. But you will see here that when she walks up, that she's pretty scared to trade, right? And if I do trade with her, it's going to be very, very difficult. Here, I was being careful because I knew Viego was around and my jungler was top. But I know that after Viego begins to cross to top side, that he's not going to be around. And as you can see here, I take pretty much no damage back, right? So eventually you kind of reach that point, especially, as the lane goes longer and longer, where you just start to stat check your opponent and you can push them off the wave completely, particularly if they're AP champs. Probably the worst matchups for you as Kassadins are ones where you will be playing against a strong laning AD champion mid as well as a ganking jungler. So this game I'm laning against Camille mid and they have an Elise, which is going to mean that if I do take damage, I'm definitely getting dived by Elise, and also it's going to be extremely hard to trade against Camille at pretty much any point in the game. So the way you want to manage these lanes is just to play for team fights instead, pretty much. Kind of sounds dumb because it's not much to do with the laning phase, but again, similar to every other matchup, you kind of play safe for at least the first 3 levels. Again, try not to take too much damage, because if you do, you are going to get dived. You can see here I managed to kind of get to this point where the wave is crashing, but I haven't taken a whole lot of damage, so I'm not really gankable. The one nice thing again that I said about your items in these matchups that I said at the start is that you can start Darksteel, which feels very good. Now, if you get lucky, your opponent will continue to push this wave. Here, I believe it was actually going to push, and then he started to kind of thin it out a bit. This is interesting because it means it's going to push to him slower, which normally I think is actually better for you, because sometimes you can actually look for a gank as this wave pushes out, because the wave does get very big, which makes it quite hard for the enemy mid to 2v2. So here, Elise shows top, which means I am safe, and I also have Kindred around mid. So I think I should be fine at this point. I believe I did take a pretty bad trade here. There isn't actually much you can do about this. Again, you're just trying to make sure you don't die. So, I think I'm like trying to walk up. I think I'm trying to clear the CS. Even with a big creep wave, unfortunately, Camille is just a lot stronger than Kassadin trades. There's not much I can do about that. But eventually, what's his name? Kindred comes mid to kind of relieve some of the pressure. Camille was at E. We managed to get a kill. This, I would say, is luck, though. Or it's not luck, but it's like out of your control. I am banking on the fact that Camille kind of like dies to the gank and that Kindred can help me. It's a lot of stuff that's out of your control. And that's why I think if you can, you should really try and avoid matchups like this, because this, I think, is a very uncomfortable situation to be in for solo queue, where you're like reliant on your teammates to help you. So yeah, I would really recommend avoiding the strong AD lane bully champs. Pretty much any top laner, like a Renekton, Camille, Aurelia, or some of the like lane bullies like Tristan and Lucian. I would really try and avoid those matchups if you can. When you team fight on Kassadin, most of it kind of comes from the setup beforehand. So as we talked about in the tips and tricks section, making sure you have the right amount of ult stacks and kind of stacking up your Conqueror as well is really important. If you can find a flank, that's really good, because it means that it's just going to be a bit more difficult for your opponents to position. But you can see in this fight that I kind of stack my ult and stack my Conqueror up on this Sejuani, and that means when I actually come to fight this Riven, that I'm already basically as strong as I could possibly be. And I think if I'd just gone on the Riven initially, she would probably just beat me in the 1v1, but because I'm basically fully stacked here, I can get off so many, fully charged ultimates and deal a huge amount of damage. Even if you don't have Conqueror, choosing your moments is really, really important. So you can see here, I'm kind of trying to play on the edge of the fight until some of the cooldowns get used. So I actually want you to pay attention. Like when I go in here, I take a couple steps back before I fully commit. So, I look on the Blitzcrank. If I had Conqueror, I'd be stacking it on him, obviously. This is when I was testing the Comet Kassadin. And then once cooldowns are used, that's kind of your permission to start going forward. If you do have a tankier build like I do in this clip, it's very, very hard for people to deal with you. And oftentimes you can end up cleaning up pretty much everyone off the back of the fight, especially if they've already wasted all their cooldown. If you can find a good team fight position, either by ulting behind them or TPing behind them or something like that, it puts you in a much better spot to actually capitalize them once they overextend or once they use their cooldown. So you can see here, we've got a double flank here with both the Rengar and the Kassadin. So they're really pushed up to the tower, and then they really just don't have anywhere to go. You can see I'm, again, similar to the last fight, I kind of take my time. Like most of the time on Kassadin, you don't need to rush the fight. So I go in, I, again, get some conk stacks, I get exhausted, so I'm happy to just kite out for a bit. And then once cooldowns are used, once I'm ready to go again, I return to the team fight. I think the last really important skill to Kassadin team fighting is just knowing kind of when to leave the fight. So a lot of the time on Kassadin, you are a cleanup champion, right? Which means you're kind of waiting for those cooldowns to be used before you really kind of come online. But there is sort of a point where the fight might turn kind of against you, or you need to get out, or for whatever reason you can't keep going. And we'll kind of see that here. So initially, we kill this Garen, we kill this Echo, everything's looking really good. We're kind of chasing these 3 targets here. We've just seen the Taric stun used, Jack's stun used as well, so everything's looking really good to just come in and engage. The problem that ends up happening here is that we kind of run out of damage, and I'm forced to leave, right? So even though the cooldowns were done, Ultimately, I do not deal enough damage to kill this Jax before he kills me, so I'm able to just take this kill and get out. This is the really nice thing about Kassadin, is that you really get to choose your fights at pretty much every stage of the game. So if a fight's bad for you, you know, even if you can't actually get a team fight win, you might be able to go in and kind of grab a kill and get back out, and oftentimes that will allow you to scale up just a bit faster, and then you'll kind of come online to the point where, you know, once you're level 16, once you've got some tank items and some AP, no one can really stop you anymore. So in my opinion, the Kassadin matchups look something like this, but I think Kassadin matchups in general, your mileage can vary a lot, and the reason is that you are just very heavily impacted by jungle, right? So if your jungle camps mid, it's going to make a lot of these matchups significantly easier. There's also a lot of them on here, you know, a champion like LeBlanc, where in the 1v1, it's actually pretty good for Kassadin, especially after level 6, but, you know, if you misplay in the early game, it can be really tough. If she gets a kill in an early skirmish, if you guys have a lot of 2v2s, it's not going to be good. If she goes some sort of weird, like, legal tempo build, you know, it can be hard. So a lot of different champions have options, right? Like TF is another one where you could have some sort of AD build with Triforce. Katarina can go AD as well. So this is kind of, you know, assuming it's like a standard matchup, it's like played out normally and like the junglers haven't impacted it too much, but just the reality is League of Legends doesn't work like that. For the most part, champions that are AP and that are relatively weak in lane are going to be better for Kassadin. It gives you time to scale. It makes it easier to trade back against them. It normally means you can beat them in the side lane as well, which is really, really good. The champs that tend to be more difficult are the heavy AD lane bullies. So you can assume that any top laner that isn't listed here, again, you know, like your Camille's and stuff, should be pretty high up there. They're going to be very, very hard. You can't beat them in side lane. It's going to be very difficult to beat them in lane as well. There are some AD champs that you can beat. So AD assassins like Talon and Kiana, while they do have advantage over you in the first few levels, it's actually pretty good for you once you kind of get tankier, and especially in the mid game, you actually deal very well with them because you can get a lot of armor. Champions like Yone and Yasuo, again, it's kind of jungle dependent. I think 1v1 is actually pretty solid for Kassadin, but you do have to be, you know, very careful of them setting up ganks, and also they're very gankable in their own right. So I would be okay picking into these, but normally I'd probably prefer something else. The difficult AP champs are the ones that either can bully really hard early or can really punish you for dashing on them. So champs like Vex and Cassio. But yeah, for the most part, if you kind of pick Kassadin into the freer AP matchups, you're going to have a very good time. If you're playing Kassadin all the time, you're going to have to learn how to manage these tough matchups because some of them, they're not very fun. So guys, that's going to be it for my Kassadin guide. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comment section below. It has been a while since I made a champion guide, but I figured, you know, it's maybe time to put some more out. So if you did like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.